The hum of the engines echoed softly inside the cabin of the private jet, a sound that usually promised luxury and calm. Leather seats gleamed under the soft golden lights. Glasses of champagne sparkled on polished trays, and the faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air. It was the kind of setting where passengers expected perfection, every detail precise, every gesture smooth. But that morning, beneath the shine and order, a storm was quietly brewing. At the center of it all sat a man in his late 40s. Sharp suit, polished shoes, posture straight as a blade. He had an air of calm authority, though to anyone who didn't know him, he looked like just another wealthy traveler. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were measured. Deliberate. Across from him stood Maria, the lead flight attendant. Her smile was polished, but her eyes betrayed impatience. To her, he wasn't a guest to be served, he was another entitled passenger testing her patience. She had served men like him before, men who believed their money gave them the right to command. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "I'll ask you again, please remain seated until we complete our checks." The man raised his gaze slowly, locking eyes with her. His tone was calm, almost unsettlingly calm. "I'm not moving. I'm exactly where I need to be." Her jaw tightened. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension thickening in the air. One of the junior attendants shot Maria a nervous glance, silently pleading with her to ease off. But Maria pressed on. "Listen," she whispered sharply, leaning closer. "On this jet, I set the rules for safety. You may be used to ordering people around, but here you follow protocol." The man didn't flinch. His steady gaze made it clear he was no ordinary traveler. Yet Maria mistook his composure for arrogance. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until it snapped. Her voice rose, sharper now. "Don't stare at me like that. Do you think you're above everyone else here?" Passengers froze. The junior attendants went pale. The cabin, once luxurious and calm, now felt like a pressure chamber. And then, without warning, Maria's hand lashed out. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin like lightning. Glasses rattled. A shocked gasp spread across the aisle. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Maria's hand trembled at her side, her chest rising and falling quickly as if even she couldn't believe what she had done. The man's head had turned slightly with the force, but when he straightened again, his expression was unreadable. No anger, no surprise, just silence. That silence was louder than any shout. One of the younger attendants whispered under her breath, "Oh my God," while another clutched the service tray so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Maria's confidence faltered. She had crossed a line, but pride in something darker kept her standing tall. She muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear, "Maybe now you'll learn some respect." The man adjusted his cufflink eyes, never leaving hers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move from his seat. Instead, his calm became almost terrifying, a stillness that made every second drag like an eternity. Round them, the crew shifted nervously, some glancing at each other, some stealing looks at him, as if waiting for a reaction that never came. Maria tried to maintain control of the moment, but the more the silence stretched, the more her facade cracked. She cleared her throat, straightened her jacket, and turned away as though the slap had ended the confrontation. But deep down, she knew the room hadn't reset. Something irreversible had just begun. The man finally spoke. His voice was low, smooth, but each word carried weight. "Interesting, very interesting, nothing more." Just that, and it was enough to send a chill down the spine of everyone present. Maria blinked, suddenly uneasy. Her confidence wavered. She couldn't read him. Was he angry, plotting retaliation, or simply dismissing her? That uncertainty gnawed at her, even as she forced herself to keep moving, serving drinks, pretending nothing had happened. But every eye in the cabin knew better. Something was about to unfold, something far bigger than a slap. The engines roared louder as the jet prepared for takeoff. But inside, all anyone could hear was the echo of that strike hand, the calm, unreadable stare of the man Maria had just humiliated. And in that moment, not a soul on board knew the truth. The man she slapped wasn't a mere passenger. He was the billionaire who owned the jet, and her fate was already sealed. What he would do next would shock everyone on board. The echo of the slap still hung in the cabin like smoke after an explosion. No one spoke. No one moved. The private jet's engines purred beneath their feet, but inside, silence pressed down like a weight. Then, in the corner, one of the junior attendants finally broke. Her voice trembled as she whispered, almost involuntarily, "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" Every head turned. Maria froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Mr. Carter. The name struck her like a blow to the chest. The sharply dressed man, still seated, still composed, turned his eyes toward the young attendant who had spoken. For the first time, a flicker of recognition passed across his face, as though he had just been reminded that the mask of anonymity had slipped. Maria's mind raced. She knew the name. Everyone in the aviation industry did. Alexander Carter, billionaire, CEO, owner of multiple corporations, and the very man who had funded the fleet of jets she was standing in. And she had just slapped him. Her knees weakened. The other crew members exchanged panicked glances. Some looked at Maria with wide eyes. silently asking, "What have you done?" Others focused on Carter, waiting for an explosion of anger, some sharp demand that would end all of their careers in a heartbeat. But it didn't come. Instead, Carter leaned back in his seat, straightening his tie with slow precision. His calm was unnerving, like the stillness of the ocean before a hurricane. Maria swallowed hard and tried to recover her composure. Her voice came out brittle, cracking under the pressure. "Sir, I didn't realize." He raised a single hand, silencing her instantly. No words, just a gesture. The silence became unbearable. Every passing second was a punishment in itself. One of the crew members, desperate to fill the void, stammered out nervously, "Mr. Carter, we can fix this. Please forgive." But Carter's eyes slid toward him, cold and deliberate. The words died in his throat. Maria's mind spun in chaos. She wanted to apologize, to beg, to explain, but the weight of the room told her it wouldn't matter. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Then Carter finally spoke. His voice was low, smooth, but with an edge that cut through the cabin. "I don't raise my voice," he said. "I don't need to." Every syllable landed like a hammer. Maria trembled. She had expected anger, maybe even shouting. But this quiet certainty was far worse. The younger attendants huddled near the galley, whispering in frantic tones, "Is he going to fire us? All of us? What if he grounds the flight? What if he calls security when we land?" Their hushed panic only heightened the tension. Maria, desperate now, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I truly didn't know it was you." If I had. His gaze snapped to hers. She froze mid-sentence. "That's the problem," he said evenly. "You didn't know, and so you thought it was acceptable." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just about who he was, it was about what she had done. About the principle. She had disrespected a man simply because she thought she could get away with it. Carter leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely. The calm in his voice only deepened the dread in the room. "Do you think I carry my name like a shield? That respect is owed to me because of money or title." Maria stammered. "No, sir, I only meant respect." He interrupted. "Isn't conditional. It isn't selective. If you treat strangers with contempt, it reveals more about you than about them." The words cut deeper than any shout. They weren't just a rebuke, they were a judgment. A mirror held up to Maria in front of everyone. Her face flushed crimson. She wanted to disappear. The cabin was suffocating now. Every pair of eyes glued to Carter, waiting for the final blow. But he didn't deliver it. Instead, he leaned back once more, his expression unreadable, his silence returning like a shadow. The crew stood frozen, unsure if they should continue their duties, apologize further, or simply vanish. And Maria, her pride shattered, stood rooted to the spot, knowing her fate now rested entirely in the hands of the man she had just humiliated. The engines rumbled as the jet cut through the sky. But inside, no one dared to breathe too loudly, because now they all knew the truth. The man Maria had struck wasn't just a passenger. He was Alexander Carter, the billionaire, the owner, the man who could end careers with a single word, and his silence promised that he was far from finished. Greatness often looks effortless in the present, but behind every calm, every measured glance, lies a story carved in pain, struggle, and sacrifice. To understand why Alexander Carter's silence carried more weight than rage, we need to travel back far from the luxury of the jet to a childhood where nothing came easily. Alexander Carter was born in a small, forgotten neighborhood on the edge of the city. Cracked sidewalks, dim streetlights, and the constant hum of sirens were the soundtrack of his youth. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, while his father, when he was around, juggled odd jobs that never seemed to last. Money was scarce, opportunities even scarcer. But even as a boy, Carter carried something different in his eyes. Teachers noticed it first, a quiet intensity, a refusal to accept failure as permanent. While others gave in to the streets, young Alexander stayed late in classrooms, burying himself in books he borrowed and sometimes couldn't afford to return. "Why do you try so hard?" a classmate once asked him. Carter's answer was simple, but firm. "Because I don't want to stay here forever." That fire carried him through nights of hunger, through mornings where his shoes were too worn to hide the holes. It carried him when he faced insults and prejudice in classrooms that doubted him. In interviews where people looked at his skin before they looked at his resume, every rejection hardened him. Every insult sharpened him. In college, things didn't get easier. He was one of the few black students in his business program, constantly underestimated, constantly questioned. Professors praised his work but advised him to temper his ambition. Recruiters smiled at his grades but chose others with weaker resumes and lighter skin. One day, after yet another rejection, his roommate found him sitting in silence. "Man, why do you keep putting yourself through this? They don't want you." Carter looked up, his voice steady. "Then I'll build something they can't ignore." And he did. Starting with nothing but grit, he launched a small logistics company from his cramped apartment. He worked 20-hour days, often sleeping on his office floor. Competitors laughed. Banks denied him loans. Some clients walked away the moment they saw who was running the business. But Carter refused to fold. He found a way around every closed door. When banks said no, he crowdfunded from his community. When big clients turned him down, he took smaller ones and delivered with precision so sharp they couldn't ignore him. His company grew not overnight, but brick by brick, contract by contract. Years of sweat and sacrifice turned into decades of empire. From logistics to tech, from real estate to aviation, Alexander Carter's name became synonymous with resilience. He didn't just break barriers, he built pathways for others to follow. But through it all, Carter never forgot the sting of disrespect. The smirks when he walked into boardrooms, the whispers that he didn't belong, the quiet, constant suggestion that success wasn't meant for men like him. That's why he led with discipline. That's why he demanded respect not for himself alone, but for everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Respect is the foundation, he often told his executives. Without it, an empire is just sand waiting to collapse. Those who worked under him learned quickly. Carter was not a man of half measure. He rewarded loyalty and humility, but arrogance, disrespect, that was the one currency he never tolerated. So, on that jet, when Maria's hand struck his face, it wasn't just a physical blow. It was an echo of every insult he had endured, every dismissal, every door slammed in his youth. It was the embodiment of the very arrogance he had built his life fighting against, and yet, he didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't strike back. Because Carter had learned long ago control is power. The man who loses his temper loses his leverage, so he stayed. Silent, calm, patient, allowing the weight of the moment to crush the guilty more than any words ever could. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of a man who had built an empire with his own hands. The silence of a leader who knew that the true reckoning was yet to come. Every uniform tells a story. It may look crisp, polished, and professional on the outside, but underneath, it often hides scars, frustrations, and quiet battles no one ever sees. Maria's uniform was no different, but to the passengers who boarded the jet, she was just another smiling attendant, her hair neatly pinned back, her scarf tied perfectly, her posture straight as steel. But beneath that polished surface, Maria was a woman whose dreams had soured into resentment. Maria hadn't always been this way. When she was younger, she carried big ambitions. She didn't want to be just a flight attendant. She wanted to manage, to lead, to climb the ladder in the aviation world. In her early years, she believed she was on her way. She worked hard, took extra shifts, and volunteered for the most difficult assignments. She dreamed of wearing the stripes of a chief purser or even moving into operations management. But years went by, and the promotions never came. She watched colleagues younger than her get fast. She saw others, less experienced, leap ahead while she remained in the same role. The rejections piled up, each one bruising her pride a little more. Maybe next year. Maria, you're valuable where you are. You're such a steady hand we can't afford to lose you in the cabin. The words sounded flattering, but to Maria, they felt like chains. She began to see passengers differently. At first, serving high-profile clients filled her with pride. She thought, look at me, rubbing shoulders with the rich and powerful. But over time, that pride curdled into bitterness. To her, they weren't impressive, they were reminders of everything she didn't have. Their designer clothes, their casual arrogance, the way they treated the staff as invisible. The envy grew sharper. She looked at every luxury watch, every leather briefcase, every dismissive smirk, and thought, why them? Why not me? In those moments, Maria's smile became mechanical. Behind it, contempt simmered. Her colleagues noticed the change. Maria, you've been snapping a lot lately, one junior attendant whispered after a flight. I'm fine, Maria snapped back, though her tone only proved otherwise. When she was younger, she had patience. But now, every small inconvenience from a passenger felt like a personal insult. Every command felt like a reminder of her own lack of power. And so, over time, Maria learned to hide her bitterness behind the mask of the uniform. She performed her duties. She smiled on cue, but inside, she was a storm, waiting for a spark. That spark arrived on Carter's flight. To Maria. He hadn't looked like a billionaire that morning. He had carried himself with quiet authority, yes, but without the obvious displays of wealth she had grown used to spotting. No loud designer labels, no flashy jewelry. Just a man who seemed too confident. And that calmness annoyed her. Something in her bristled when he didn't respond to her instructions with the usual deference she expected. Instead of compliance, she felt indifference, almost as if he didn't acknowledge her authority at all. For Maria, already carrying years of frustration, that was enough to twist annoyance into anger. Another man who thinks he doesn't have to listen. Another man who thinks he's above the rules. Her prejudice filled the blanks. She assumed he was just another entitled passenger. Another wealthy man looking down on her. And in her mind, she wasn't slapping a stranger. She was slapping years of disappointment, years of rejection, years of envy bottled up inside her. But here's the irony. The uniform Maria wore, the one that gave her a sense of professionalism and power, was also the very thing that trapped her. It demanded patience. It demanded humility. It demanded respect even when she didn't feel it. And on that flight, in that moment, she failed the very code the uniform represented. Her hand had lashed out, but it wasn't only against Carter. It was against her life, her circumstances, her unfulfilled dreams. Now, as she stood in that cabin, realizing who Carter truly was, Maria's heart sank, because deep down, she knew the truth. The man she had struck wasn't just another passenger. He was the very embodiment of everything she wedded: power, success, discipline, and he was about to show her just how much one impulsive moment could cost. Silence. That was all Carter gave them. No outburst, no demand, not even a raised eyebrow, just silence. And somehow, it was heavier than any explosion of anger could have been. The cabin felt smaller, the air tighter. The hum of the engines was the only sound, vibrating beneath the floor as if echoing the tension in the room. Maria stood frozen, her hands still tingling from the slap she had delivered just moments ago. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, betraying the panic she tried to hide behind a mask of control. But Carter's piercing eyes stripped her facade away, piece by piece. The rest of the crew shifted nervously. One young attendant cleared his throat, whispering, "Sir, would you like a glass of water?" His voice cracked. Carter didn't answer. He didn't even glance at him. The silence stretched longer. It was unbearable. To the crew, it felt like standing in front of a judge after committing a crime, waiting for a verdict that might destroy them. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Carter wasn't just a passenger. He was a man with power, the kind of power that decided careers, reputations, futures, and every second he refused to speak made it clear he was measuring them, weighing them, deciding their fate. Maria's mind spiraled. Say something, apologize, explain anything. But when she opened her mouth, no words came out. Her throat was dry, her voice caught. All she could do was stand there, sweating under the cabin lights, while Carter remained perfectly composed in his seat. It was his calmness that terrified her most. She would have preferred him shouting, raging, even calling security. That would have been easier to face. But this quiet, unshakable patience, it felt like standing on trial against a man who didn't need to raise his voice to ruin her life. Finally, Carter moved. He leaned back in his leather seat, folded his hands together, and studied Maria like a professor analyzing a failing student. Not cruel, not smug, just deliberate. The silence didn't break. It deepened, because in his gaze, Maria saw something worse than anger: disappointment. And disappointment has a way of cutting deeper than rage. The other attendants began to wilt. One looked down at his shoes. Another fumbled with the service cart, pretending to reorganize items just to avoid eye contact. The cabin had become a courtroom, and Carter was the judge. No one dared speak unless spoken to. Then, at last, Carter's voice came low, steady, precise. "Do you understand what you've done?" The words weren't shouted. They were measured, but they struck harder than any scream. Maria swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. I didn't mean." Carter raised a hand, cutting her off. Not violently, just firmly. The same silence returned, swallowing her excuses before they could leave her mouth. He looked at the crew, one by one, holding their gaze until they dropped it. He didn't need to lecture them. His silence was the lecture. His composure was the punishment. Maria's legs wobbled. She felt like collapsing into her seat, but pride forced her to stand tall. Still, her thoughts betrayed her. He knows. He knows I crossed the line. He knows I let my bitterness control me. Every second he delayed his judgment made her chest pound louder. Because the truth was clear, his silence wasn't indecision. It was intention. He wanted them to feel the weight of it, to taste the consequences before he even spoke them aloud, and they did. The jet continued its steady climb through the clouds, but inside, it felt like freefall. For Maria, every detail magnified: the ticking of her watch, the faint hiss of the air vents, the slow blink of Carter's eyes as he observed her. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't flustered. He was waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the words that would decide everything. And Maria knew she couldn't escape them. The silence broke at last. Carter's voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the thick air of the cabin like a blade. "Tell me," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crew, "what does professionalism mean to you?" No one answered. The question hung heavy, heavier than any reprimand. Each attendant shifted uncomfortably, unsure if speaking would save them or condemn them. Finally, one of the younger attendants, trembling slightly, stepped forward. His voice was soft, but it carried a certain honesty, putting the client first, no matter what, respecting them, even when they're difficult. Carter tilted his head, studying the young man, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, he nodded once. "And accountability?" Carter asked, turning his eyes to the others. "What does that mean to you?" A woman from the crew cleared her throat nervously. "It means owning your actions, taking responsibility for mistakes, even when it's uncomfortable." Her eyes flicked toward Maria, but she quickly looked down at the carpet. The implication was obvious, but she hadn't dared say it aloud. Maria's jaw tightened. Heat flushed her face. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, but Carter's presence pinned her in place. She could feel the cracks forming and the team loyalty unraveling thread by thread. Another attendant spoke up, his tone sharper, almost defensive. "Sir, Maria has worked harder than anyone here. She made a mistake. Yes, but we all have." It's not fair to judge her for one moment. The words hung in the air, bold but risky. The others avoided his eyes, afraid to be pulled into his defiance. Carter's gaze lingered on him. His face betrayed nothing, no anger, no approval, just silence. And that silence was worse than a verdict. Maria clung to the man's defense like a lifeline. But deep inside, she knew his words weren't enough to shield her. She could feel the unspoken judgment pressing against her, heavier with every passing second. Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice low but steady. "So," he said, "you believe loyalty to a colleague outweighs respect for a client." The man faltered, his lips parted, but no answer came. He realized, too late, that Carter's questions weren't casual, they were traps, carefully laid to reveal where each person stood. The cabin grew colder. Another attendant finally broke, whispering, "Respect should always come first. Without it, we're nothing as a team." Her words were quiet, but they cut deep. Maria's chest tightened. That was the confirmation Carter was looking for. He leaned back again, folding his hands, watching as the crew splintered right in front of him. Some defended Maria, some fell silent, and some, perhaps wisely, chose to align themselves with Carter's unspoken authority. Maria's facade began to crumble. Her breathing grew uneven, her eyes darting from one colleague to the next. She could see it, the fractures widening, the cracks in the bond they once shared. The team was no longer united. They were divided, exposed under Carter's unflinching gaze. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to accuse. His questions alone were enough to peel back the layers of loyalty and reveal the truth beneath. Every word he spoke forced them to choose a side or the values they were supposed to uphold, and each answer, or lack of one's own, made the verdict clearer. The engines hummed steadily, a reminder of the world outside. But inside the jet, time felt suspended. The cabin had become an interrogation chamber, and Carter was both prosecutor and judge. The attendants fidgeted with their uniforms, their hands clasped tightly, their eyes darting anywhere but his. Carter let the silence stretch once more, watching them squirm, giving them space to reflect on what they had revealed. And though no final word had been spoken, everyone understood judgment was coming. The cabin door clicked shut, sealing Carter away from the rattled crew. For the first time since the slap, the billionaire CEO allowed himself a long, quiet breath. His private quarters, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt heavy with unspoken questions. Was this moment just one woman's lapse in control, or was it a symptom of something far worse? His aide, Jonathan, stood nearby, loyal, measured, and careful with his words. Jonathan had been at Carter's side for years. He had seen storms before, but he knew this one was different. Carter leaned against the polished mahogany desk, his voice low and steady. "Tell me, Jonathan," he asked, "am I looking at a single crack, or an entire wall crumbling?" Jonathan hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the door, as if the crew's unease could still seep through its frame. Then, he stepped forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "this wasn't the first sign." Carter's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch, but the words settled in like weights. Jonathan continued, his tone respectful but firm. "I've noticed small things. Attendants whispering about passengers. A lack of courtesy when they thought no one was watching. The arrogance of people who've grown too comfortable in your shadow." He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of his observations. Carter's jaw tightened. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. "Give me examples," Carter said, his voice calm but sharp. Jonathan obliged. "There was that night in Paris," he recalled. "One of the attendants openly mocked the client's accent. I had to pull her aside. And then, in Dubai, a senior crew member delayed boarding because he didn't like the tone of a passenger's request. Small things, perhaps, but together, they paint a picture." The air in the room thickened. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were patterns Carter had overlooked because he trusted the team he'd built. He sank into the leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His silence now was not the silence of restraint, it was the silence of calculation. "Arrogance," he muttered. "Entitlement, disrespect." Each word left his lips like a hammer striking steel. Jonathan stepped closer. "Sir, Maria's slap wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the loudest echo of what's been simmering beneath the surface for months." For a long moment, Carter stared at the floor, memories stirring. His rise to power had been built on discipline, resilience, and respect for himself, for others, for the work. To see his own crew forget those values felt like betrayal. He looked up, eyes sharp again. "So it isn't just her," he said. "It's the culture they've allowed to grow." Jonathan nodded grimly. "Yes, sir. And culture starts at the top." The words landed hard, but Carter didn't flinch. He knew Jonathan was right. Leadership wasn't just about punishing mistakes. It was about shaping the soil that allowed either weeds or roots to grow. The jet's engines hummed softly, a steady counterpoint to the storm brewing in Carter's mind. He rose, pacing slowly. "I gave them opportunity. I gave them the privilege of serving in this circle. And yet, instead of humility, they chose arrogance." He stopped at the window, staring out into the endless expanse of clouds. His reflection in the glass looked like a man weighing more than just a team's future. He was weighing a legacy. Jonathan broke the silence once more. Sir, what happened out there wasn't just about you. It was about what they think they can get away with. Today, it was a slap. Tomorrow, who knows? The implication lingered. Left unchecked, disrespect could spread like rot, infecting everything it touched. Carter's hand tightened against the window frame. He knew what Jonathan was really saying. This was not the time for half measures. He turned back, his eyes like steel. So the question is, Carter said slowly, do I salvage? Or do I rebuild? Jonathan lowered his head, not daring to answer. Some decisions weren't his to make, but Carter already knew the answer. The slap had simply pulled back the curtain. What lay behind it was far more dangerous than one woman's outburst. He exhaled once, steadying himself. Then it seems, I have no choice. Loyalty built on sand won't hold up in the storm ahead. The room fell into silence again, but this time, the silence was not of hesitation. It was the silence of resolve, discipline, respect, humility. For Carter, these weren't just words. They were the pillars that carried him from the streets of his childhood to the empire he commanded today. But to understand why the slap cut so deep, we must step back into the crucible where his philosophy was forged. The memory begins in a cramped diner. Years ago, Carter was still a young executive then, wearing a second-hand suit that didn't quite fit. He had arrived early for a meeting with a potential investor, his heart pounding with ambition. But when he walked in, the waitress didn't see a future CEO. She saw a young black man she thought didn't belong. Counters full, she said sharply, even though half the stools were empty. Take it to go. Carter's voice had been calm. Even then, I have a meeting here. She gave him a look that burned with doubt. A look that told him he was less than the others who sat comfortably sipping coffee. The investor arrived. Minutes later, a wealthy man in a tailored coat. The waitress's tone shifted instantly. Syrupy sweet. Right this way, sir. Carter never forgot the sting of that moment. Not because of the slight itself, but because of the arrogance behind it, the belief that one human being had the right to diminish another. That memory became a seed, and over the years, it grew into a vow. Never tolerate arrogance. Never excuse disrespect. When Carter built his company, he made sure his employees understood this vow. It wasn't written in the policy manual, it was woven into the culture. Discipline meant showing up prepared. No excuses. Respect meant treating every colleague, client, and stranger with dignity. And humility. It meant remembering that no one was too important to serve, not even the CEO himself. There was another moment, years later, when Carter's philosophy was tested. He had just acquired a smaller firm and was touring its headquarters. A junior manager, smug and careless, whispered just loud enough for Carter to hear, "Guys only here because of diversity quotas." The words could have sparked fury. Instead, Carter turned, looked the man square in the eyes, and asked, "Would you say that to my face in front of the board?" The man paled, stammering, caught in the web of his own arrogance. Carter didn't fire him that day. Instead, he gave him a chance to apologize, and not to Carter, but to the entire staff, reminding them all that words, like actions, carry weight. That moment became company legend. It wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. Back in the present, Carter's private cabin hummed softly with the engine's rhythm as he reflected on those lessons. The slap wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. That it was arrogance made flesh. It was disrespect, not just toward him, but toward everything he stood for. And it was the opposite of the humility he demanded from anyone privileged enough to be on his team. He remembered a speech he had given at a leadership retreat not long ago. His words were etched in the minds of those who listened. Arrogance is rot. You might not see it at first, but it eats through foundations. Respect is steel, it strengthens what we build. Humility is the mortar that binds it all together. Without these, there is no empire. There is only ruin. Those weren't just words for a stage. They were the rule by which he lived, the compass that never shifted. So when Maria struck him, it wasn't about the sting on his cheek. It was about everything that moment represented. It was a direct violation of the code that had defined his journey. And if he let it pass, if he shrugged it off as just one mistake, then what message would that send? That disrespect was tolerable. That arrogance could live unchecked under his watch. That humility was optional, not essential. No, he couldn't allow that. Not as a man, not as a leader, and not as the steward of the empire he had built. The decision forming, in his mind, wasn't just about Maria. It wasn't about one slap. It was about the culture he demanded on the price of betraying it. Jonathan, watching quietly from the corner, could see it in Carter's eyes. The storm had passed. What remained was resolve. Carter whispered to himself, almost like a mantra, discipline, respect, humility. Without them, we are nothing. He rose from his chair, the weight of his philosophy carried in every step. His reflection in the glass seemed taller now, more imposing. The man who had been slapped was gone. What remained was the leader who would not let arrogance rule his house. The cabin was silent, so silent that Carter could hear the hum of the engines like a low, steady drumbeat beneath his feet. when he stepped out of his private quarters. Every pair of eyes in the main cabin turned toward him. The crew Maria, at the front, the others behind her stood stiffly, their nerves stretched as tight as piano strings. No one breathed. No one dared to move. Carter's steps were deliberate, slow, the measured walk of a man carrying both anger and purpose. His face gave nothing away, but the air around him felt heavy, electric. He stopped in the center of the cabin, letting the silence press on the crew until it became unbearable. Then his voice cut through it, sharp and clear. Maria, the sound of her name was enough to make her flinch. "Yes, sir," she stammered, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. Carter's gaze didn't waver. "Do you know why we're standing here right now?" Maria's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean stop." Carter's tone cracked like a whip. "A misunderstanding is spilling coffee. A misunderstanding is forgetting a passenger's request. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice." Her lips parted, but no words came. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tell me, Maria, what gave you the right to put your hands on me, on any passenger, for that matter?" Maria's voice trembled. I thought you were being disrespectful. I was overwhelmed. It just happened." Carter's jaw tightened. "It just happened? Do you know how many times I've been disrespected in my life? How many times I've been underestimated, dismissed, insulted, and never once did I raise my hand in retaliation." The crew shifted uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. The weight of Carter's words hung in the cabin like smoke. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the rest of the crew. "And where were the rest of you?" His voice rose, echoing off the walls. "You watched this happen. You stood there. Not one of you stepped in. Not one of you upheld the standard of discipline, respect, or humility that this job demands." A young attendant finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "We didn't know what to do, sir." Carter's eyes burned into her. "That's the problem. You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. You wear the uniform, you serve the drinks, but you forgot the most important duty of protecting the dignity of the people in your care." Maria tried again, her voice breaking. "Sir, please." It was the heat of the moment. "I regret it deeply. I'm asking for another chance." Carter's face softened for just a second, as if he were considering her plea. But then his expression hardened, a storm behind calm eyes. "Another chance," he repeated. "Do you think leadership is about second chances for disrespect? Do you think trust, once broken, can simply be patched over with regret?" Maria's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry." He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but cutting sharper than ever. "Sorry doesn't undo arrogance. Sorry doesn't erase disrespect. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust." The tension in the cabin grew unbearable. The hum of the engines was the only sound, like a metronome counting down to the inevitable. Carter straightened, towering over them. "You've all failed me. Not just Maria, all of you. Because arrogance unchecked spreads like rot. Because silence in the face of wrong makes you complicit." The words struck like blows, one after another, and no one could meet his gaze. This wasn't just her mistake, this was a team failure. And when the team fails, leadership must act. The attendant stiffened, realizing what was coming. Maria's eyes welled with tears. "Please, sir, don't end all of our careers for this. We'll do better, I swear." Carter's voice rose, commanding. "Final, it's too late for that. The moment you allowed arrogance to live on this plane, you broke the code that holds everything together. And I do not build my empire on broken foundations." Gasps rippled through the crew. "You're done," Carter said flatly. "All of you. When we land, you'll be relieved of duty, effective immediately." Silence fell again, heavier this time, absolute. Maria's sobs were quiet, but no one reached out to comfort her. The rest of the crew stared at the floor, shame painted across their faces. Carter turned his back on them, walking toward the front of the cabin. Each step echoed like a gavel striking in a courtroom, delivering a verdict no one could appeal. At the door, he paused. His voice carried back, calm but edged with steel. "Discipline, respect, humility. I told you once, without these, we are nothing, and you proved me right." Then he opened the door and disappeared into his private quarters, leaving the crew standing in the wreckage of their own failure. The silence after Carter's verdict lingered like smoke in the air. The crew stood frozen, their uniforms suddenly feeling like weights strapped to their shoulders. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak, and then Carter moved. He walked back into his private quarters, calm but unwavering, every step measured like a man who already knew the outcome of a trial. He didn't slam the door. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he sat at his sleek, polished desk inside the cabin, pulled out his phone, and began to dial. The sound of those digits pressing was louder than thunder in Maria's ears. Each tone was a countdown, each vibration a step closer to the end. The line clicked. A professional voice answered. "Human Resources, this is Angela." Carter's reply was crisp, cold, almost surgical. "Angela, this is Carter Reynolds. I need the operations manager on this call, now." There was a pause. Then, a nervous acknowledgement. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds. Right away, Seconds later, another voice joined in, confident, polished, but with the slight edge of someone surprised by an unexpected call. "This is Daniel, operations manager. What can I do for you, sir?" Carter's tone didn't waver. "Effective immediately, I am terminating the employment of the current in-flight crew on Jet 7. All of them." The other side of the line fell into stunned silence. Daniel spoke first, cautiously. "Sir, all of them? Do you mean the lead attendant, or all of them?" Carter cut in. "No exceptions. I'll expect written confirmations filed and replacement staff dispatched before we land. Do I make myself clear?" The silence broke. "Yes, sir. Crystal clear," Daniel replied quickly, the gravity in his voice revealing he knew better than to question this decision further. Angela chimed in softly, almost hesitantly. "Mr. Reynolds, should we record the reason for their termination?" Carter's eyes hardened as he leaned back in his seat. His voice dropped to a cold finality. "Record it under one word: disrespect." Back in the main cabin, Maria clutched her apron, her knuckles white. The crew whispered nervously among themselves, their voices trembling. "Do you think he's serious?" one of them asked, her words barely a whisper. Maria shook her head, though her voice betrayed her own disbelief. No, he can't mean it. It's just to scare us. He wouldn't end all our careers over one mistake." But deep down, she already knew the truth. Carter Reynolds wasn't a man who used threats. He was a man who delivered consequences. Minutes later, Carter returned. He didn't bring shouting or rage. He brought silence colder than any outburst could ever be. He stopped in the aisle, his phone still in his hand. Then, with absolute calm, he delivered the words that shattered the crew's last hope. "It's done," he said. "Human Resources has processed your termination. When we land, your IDs will be deactivated, your access revoked, and your careers in this company ended. Effective immediately." Maria gasped as if the air had been punched from her lungs. One of the junior attendants broke into tears, covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. Another sank into her seat, her eyes glazed with shock. It felt unreal, like the walls of the cabin had closed in on them, sealing their fate. Maria stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Mr. Reynolds, please. We've given years to this company. We've served loyally. Doesn't that count for something?" Carter's gaze locked on her, steady and unyielding. "Loyalty is not measured by years. It's measured by moments. And in the moment when it mattered most, when respect was required, you chose arrogance instead. You all did. That is the only thing that counts today." Maria's tears streamed freely now. Her colleagues tried to console her, but their own fear and shame made their gestures hollow. Carter turned away. His verdict final. The engines roared outside, carrying the jet steadily through the night sky. But inside, the cabin felt like a courtroom where the gavel had already struck, where the sentence had been sealed. The crew sat in silence, broken, their futures unraveling at 30,000 feet. Maria whispered through sobs, more to herself than to anyone else. One mistake, and it's all gone." But the truth was harsher. It hadn't been one mistake. It had been an attitude, a culture of arrogance that Carter had seen festering long before this flight. Tonight was simply the night he chose to end it. Carter walked back into his private quarters, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to argue further. His calmness was the loudest message of all. Outside, the crew sat in the wreckage of their choices, the sound of their quiet sobs swallowed by the endless hum of the engines. And as the jet soared higher into the dark, one thing became painfully clear: Carter Reynolds wasn't just a CEO. He was a man who demanded respect, and those who denied it had no place in his world. The jet's wheels screeched against the tarmac, a thunderous reminder that the night in the sky had finally ended. But for Carter Reynolds and his former crew, the real storm was only beginning. As the aircraft taxied toward the private hangar, the atmosphere inside was suffocating. Maria and her colleagues sat stiff, uniforms creased by hours of tension, their faces drained of color. They weren't just employees anymore, they were ex-employees, and the reality of that sank deeper with every passing second. Carter, meanwhile, sat upright in his leather seat, composed, unreadable. He didn't glance their way. He didn't need to. His silence carried further weight than 1,000 words ever could. The doors opened. The humid air of the city rushed in, but with it came whispers, cameras, and the unmistakable hum of curiosity. A handful of reporters, tipped off by someone within the company, were already there. Microphones extended, flashes sparked, and questions flew into the night. "Mr. Reynolds, is it true you just fired your entire flight crew midair? Was this an abuse of power, or a show of leadership? Did the slap actually happen, sir?" Carter didn't flinch. He walked down the steps of the jet with the precision of a soldier, ignoring the noise. His aides stayed close behind, shielding him from the chaos. But the headlines were already being written in real time. Behind him, Maria and the crew were escorted off quietly. Their once proud uniforms now felt like a brand of shame. They lowered their heads, trying to avoid the flash of cameras. But it was too late. Their humiliation was now public. By sunrise, the story had spread across every major business network. Headlines blared in bold. "Billionaire CEO fires entire crew mid-flight." Carter Reynolds, ruthless or righteous? Slap in the sky sparks corporate earthquake. Social media lit up with debates. Some praised Carter for demanding accountability. Others criticized him for what they called excessive punishment. One tweet went viral. Imagine slapping your CEO mid-flight and still expecting to have a job when you land. Actions have consequences. Another, just as popular, countered, firing an entire crew over one mistake. This isn't leadership, it's tyranny. The world was split, but no one was silent. Inside Carter's corporation, the whispers carried a different tone. Employees huddled in office hallways, murmuring to one another. Did you hear? He finally did it. He cleaned house. About time. That crew thought they were untouchable. Maria was always pushing boundaries. This wasn't the first complaint. To some, Carter's decision wasn't shocking, it was overdue. The crew had carried themselves with arrogance, believing proximity to the CEO's jet made them immune to accountability. That illusion had shattered in a single night. One junior analyst summed it up best as he whispered to a colleague. He's not just leading a company, he's setting a culture. If disrespect won't be tolerated in the skies, it won't be tolerated anywhere. Meanwhile, Maria sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzing endlessly with notifications. Some messages were sympathetic friends, consoling her, telling her the decision was too harsh. But others were cruel, mocking her downfall. She replayed the moment of the slap in her mind again and again. What had felt like a moment of righteous indignation had spiraled into the end of her career. Why did I do it? She whispered to herself, voice breaking. Why couldn't I just hold my tongue? Her colleagues fared no better. Each was left scrambling to explain the firing to their families, their resumes suddenly scarred by the most public dismissal of the year. But for Carter, the fallout was not about individuals. It was about principles. That morning, he gathered his senior leadership team in the top-floor boardroom of his headquarters. His words were calm, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Last night wasn't about a slap. It was about culture. If arrogance, disrespect, or entitlement exists in any corner of this company, it dies today. Effective immediately, every manager will be held accountable for the behavior of their teams. We lead with discipline. We lead with respect. No exceptions. The room was silent. Some nodded firmly, inspired by his resolve. Others shifted uneasily, knowing their own leadership would soon be under scrutiny. Outside the corporate towers, the public kept debating. Business analysts appeared on morning shows dissecting Carter's decision. One anchor said, "It's drastic." Yes, but drastic is sometimes what's needed to reset a culture. Another countered, or it's ego. Leaders who act unilaterally like this often spark more fear than loyalty. The divide grew wider, but through it all, Carter remained unmoved. He didn't chase public approval. He didn't issue apologies. His decision stood, firm as stone. Yet, in the quiet of his office that evening, Carter allowed himself one moment of reflection. He looked out over the city skyline, the lights flickering like stars. The weight of leadership pressed on his shoulders, not just the weight of running a company, but of shaping the values that defined it. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Had he been too ruthless, or had he simply done what no one else dared to do? Silence has a strange way of echoing louder than noise. For Maria, that silence came the morning after. No flight schedules, no uniform neatly pressed, no headset crackling with passenger requests. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet of her small apartment, and the reality that she had been fired, dismissed, in disgrace, not for lack of skill, but for arrogance and prejudice she had long refused to acknowledge. She sat by the window, the city bustling below, yet she felt like a ghost within it. Her mind replayed that moment, the slap, the gasps, the piercing look in Carter's eyes. She whispered into the stillness, almost as if confessing to herself, "What have I done?" For the first time in years, Maria felt shame that cut deeper than anger. Not the shame of losing a job, but of losing herself. She remembered every smug remark she'd made, every assumption she had carried about the man she thought was just another passenger. And now, that man had destroyed her career with a single phone call. Meanwhile, across town, Carter sat in his office, sleek minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the city skyline. His assistants whispered about the chaos from yesterday, about the debate raging online, about employees still buzzing over his bold decision. But Carter remained quiet, his eyes fixed on a simple folder sitting on his desk. Inside it were the names of the dismissed crew members, including Maria. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and muttered to himself, "Discipline is easy. Forgiveness, that's the hard part." The thought gnawed at him. He had built his empire on principles of respect and accountability, never tolerating arrogance, no matter the form. But he also believed in growth, that people could change if confronted with their flaws. The question now was, did Maria deserve that chance? Back in her apartment, Maria pulled out a shoebox she hadn't touched in years. Inside were letters, photographs, and a worn-out badge from her first day as a flight attendant. She had been so proud back then, wide-eyed, eager, and grateful just to serve people, no matter who they were. Somewhere along the way, pride had turned into superiority. Her phone buzzed. A text from an old colleague read, "Tough break, Maria, but maybe it's what you needed. Think about it. She dropped the phone, tears filling her eyes. She had spent years looking down on others, but now the roles were reversed. She was the one being whispered about, pitied, judged. For the first time, Maria felt the sting of the very arrogance she had once inflicted on others. Carter, too, could not escape reflection. He remembered his own journey, how he had once been underestimated, dismissed because of his background and skin color. He had fought tooth and nail to prove himself, and perhaps that was why Maria's slap had cut so deeply. It wasn't just personal, it was symbolic of every barrier he had overcome. Yet he couldn't shake the image of her face when she realized her mistake. The shock, the regret, the silent plea for another chance. Was he now standing at the edge of becoming like those who once denied him? Two worlds, both filled with silence, both wrestling with choices. Maria whispered to herself again, voice trembling, if I ever get another chance, I'll do better. I'll be better. And Carter, staring out of his glass office, murmured, redemption or exile. The decision hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, like a door half open, waiting to be walked through. Because sometimes, punishment alone cannot transform a heart. Sometimes, the real power lies in the possibility of redemption. And as Carter reached for the folder once more, his phone rang, setting the stage for a choice that would define not just Maria's future, but his own legacy as a leader. The door of redemption was cracked open, but the question remained, would Carter step through it, or slam it shut forever? The world was watching. The incident on the private jet had already exploded across news outlets and social media. Headlines ranged from CEO fires entire flight team after disrespect to power move or principle. Every employee inside Carter's company waited with bated breath, wondering not just about the fate of the fired crew, but what this moment meant for them all. Inside the grand auditorium of his headquarters, thousands of employees gathered in person, while tens of thousands more joined virtually from offices across the globe. The air buzzed with a mix of tension and curiosity. Carter had called for an all-hands address, an extraordinary event reserved only for moments that would shape the company's future. As the lights dimmed, the chatter fell silent. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the stage. And then, Carter stepped forward. His presence commanded attention, not because of arrogance, but because of the gravity he carried. He paused at the podium, scanning the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every heartbeat to sync with his. Then, in a steady, resonant voice, he began. Yesterday, he said, an incident took place that has sparked outrage, debate, and reflection. Many of you have heard fragments of the story. Today, I want to share the truth, not to shame, not to boast, but to teach. The audience leaned in. Carter's eyes didn't waver. I was traveling on one of our jets, incognito, as I often do. I wasn't dressed in a suit. I wasn't surrounded by assistants or security. I was simply a passenger like anyone else. He let the words sink in, his tone calm yet piercing. And in that moment, some chose to treat me with disdain. They judged me by appearances, not by my humanity. They assumed that respect was optional, that dignity depended on titles, wealth, or status. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Carter raised a hand, silencing it. Here is the lesson, he continued, his voice sharpening. Respect is not earned by power. Respect is owed because we are human. Every person, whether they sweep the floors, fly the jet, or sign the checks, deserves it. Strip away our roles, and what remains is our shared humanity. The room was dead quiet. No typing, no whispering, only the weight of his words pressing into every soul present. Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. I fired that crew, not because of a single mistake, not because I enjoy punishment, but because arrogance is a disease, and if arrogance is allowed to take root in our company, it will destroy everything we have built. He gestured toward the audience, his eyes locking with employees seated in the front rows. No empire falls because of weak profits. Empires fall because of weak principles, arrogance, pride, disrespect. These are the termites that hollow out the beams of greatness. For a moment, Carter's tone shifted from stern to almost vulnerable. I know what it feels like to be underestimated. I know what it feels like to be judged by the color of my skin, by the clothes I wear, by where I come from. I've lived that reality, and that is why I will never tolerate it under my leadership. His voice trembled not from weakness, but from conviction. This company must be better. We will be better. A wave of emotion coursed through the audience. Some employees nodded, others clutched their notepads tighter. A few even wiped away tears. Then Carter straightened, his voice once again resolute. From this day forward, respect is not optional, it is our foundation. If you cannot treat every person with dignity, regardless of who they are, then this company is not your home. But if you stand for respect, for humility, for humanity, then together, we will build something that no competitor, no crisis, no scandal can ever tear down. He paused, let the silence breathe, then delivered the final line like a hammer on steel. Greatness without humanity is nothing, but humanity with greatness, that is legacy for a heartbeat. No one moved. Then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted. Applause thundered through the hall. spilling into every corner of the building and echoing across live streams worldwide. Employees stood, clapping, some shouting, some cheering, united not by fear, but by inspiration. In that moment, Carter wasn't just a CEO. He wasn't just a man who had fired a crew. He was a leader who had turned a painful incident into a timeless lesson, one that would ripple through the walls of his company and into the industry beyond. And as the applause swelled, Carter looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, rich and poor, leaders and learners, and thought to himself, this is the real power. Not money, not jets, but the ability to shape hearts. The roar of applause faded into a standing ovation. Carter stepped back from the podium, his eyes calm, his purpose clear. The lesson had been delivered. But what came next would test whether his people were ready to live it. The auditorium was empty now. The echoes of applause, the thunder of clapping hands, had faded into silence. What remained was a single man, seated alone, in his office high above the city. The skyline stretched before him, towers of steel and glass glowing against the night. Yet Carter's gaze wasn't fixed on the lights outside, it was turned inward, toward the lessons carved by a lifetime of battles. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if releasing the weight of the day. For the world, the story had been about drama, about a slap on a jet, about firings, about shockwaves through an empire. But for him, it was never about spectacle. It was about principle, humility. He whispered to himself. The word tasted both sharp and sacred. He thought of his younger years, nights spent working jobs that paid him less than he deserved. Mornings where strangers looked past him as if he were invisible. He remembered the sting of disrespect, the cruel smirk of those who thought power made them untouchable. Those memories had built him, brick by brick, into the man he was now. And tonight, they reminded him why the moral compass of his company had to remain true. Somewhere across town, Maria sat in her small apartment, the silence of her downfall heavy around her. For her, the slap that once seemed powerful now replayed as the moment her arrogance broke her life apart. She had spent years mistaking authority for superiority. Now, stripped of both, she faced the raw truth. Respect given only upward, but never downward, was no respect at all. Carter didn't see her tears, but he didn't need to. He knew the weight of such lessons. He had lived them once, though in a different form. The difference was that he had chosen to rise with humility. She had chosen to fall with pride. He poured himself a glass of water, watching the ripples shimmer under the office light. Then, softly, he spoke not to anyone else, but to the room, to the silence, perhaps even to his younger self. Leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility. It's about carrying the weight of people's lives and refusing to let arrogance poison what we build together. His voice was calm, but it carried a firmness that echoed beyond the walls. Disrespect has a cost. Always, maybe not immediately, but eventually. And the price is heavier than anyone imagines. The city outside pulsed with life, cars, lights, movement, yet up here, Carter felt detached from the chaos. What mattered was not the noise of the world, but the quiet truths that defined it. He stood and walked to the window, placing a hand against the glass. For a long moment, he simply stared at the streets, the bridges, the buildings his company had touched. He thought of the thousands of employees now inspired by his words. He thought of Maria and her crew, now forced to face the mirror of their actions. And he thought of the future. True leadership, he knew, was not about being remembered as the man who fired a team. It was about being remembered as the man who reminded an empire of its soul. He closed his eyes and exhaled again, this time lighter, freer. The decision was behind him, but the lesson would live on. In the quiet of that office. Carter smiled faintly because he understood something few leaders ever did. Legacy is not written in headlines or applause. Legacy is written in the hearts of those who carry your example forward. And as the night deepened, Carter knew his compass still pointed true. The story had begun with arrogance in the air at 30,000 feet. But it ended here, grounded in something far greater. Humility. Because power without respect crumbles. But respect with humility, that builds forever.